They called him the next Magic Johnson. Then one night on a sidewalk in Queens, everything he'd built almost disappeared in an instant. Before Kobe, before LeBron, there was a kid from Queens who was supposedly better than all of them, the #1 recruit in America, a 6'8" prodigy who couldn't even read past a 3rd grade level, and nobody around him seemed to care as long as he kept scoring. He had a coach who broke every rule in the book to become his legal guardian. He had a university that built its entire championship dream around him. And then, days before his college debut, it all came crashing down in a scandal that most people have completely forgotten about. But that wasn't even his lowest moment. That came 2 years later, when an injury on that same Queens sidewalk left him with permanent damage to his own shooting shoulder, something every single expert called a career ender. Most people would have quit right there. He didn't. What happened next took him from a cold gym in Kansas, to New Zealand, to a phone call from an old friend who had just been handed the keys to an NBA franchise, to a locker room next to David Robinson, and eventually, to a Lakers jersey in Los Angeles. This is the story of a talent so rare that the league gave him chance after chance, even when nobody thought he deserved one. Stick around to the end, because how his story actually ends will surprise you. If you spent any time on the asphalt courts of New York City in the mid-80s, you heard the whispers about this guy before you ever saw him in person. They called him Sweet Pea, a nickname that sounded far too gentle for a teenager who was literally terrorizing all 5 boroughs of the city. He wasn't just another flashy playground guard. He was a 6'8" marvel with a vision of the game like Magic Johnson and a jumper that looked like it had been perfected in a laboratory. According to Basketball Archives, by 1986, he wasn't just a local hero. He was officially recognized as the #1 college recruit in the entire country. He was the chosen one, a bridge between the grit of the streets and the glamour of the professional league. But the reality behind those highlight reel moments turned out to be far more complicated than any box score could capture. While Lloyd was dominating grown men at Rucker Park and on West 4th Street, his life off the court had become an endless carousel of classrooms and zip codes. According to major sports media reports, by the time his high school years were winding down in the mid-80s, he had attended 5 different high schools across 3 different states. It was a shell game run by coaches and handlers, people who saw a golden ticket in him but completely ignored the fact that this young man was drowning in a world he couldn't understand and couldn't even read. Reporters at the time noted that his basketball IQ was off the charts, but his life was being managed by people who cared far more about his points per game than about his personal future. The hype was a heavy cloak for a teenager from Queens who was still trying to find his footing. Every time he stepped onto the court, he wasn't just playing for a win, he was playing for his life, for his family, and for the expectations of an entire city that hadn't seen a talent like this since Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The talent was undeniable, but the foundation it all stood on was made of sand. Even as the biggest programs in the country started knocking on his door one after another, there was a growing sense that something was bound to give. While the streets had already crowned him the heir to the throne, a fierce battle to claim him was about to begin, one that would expose the fatal cracks running through the very foundation of his life. Late in the 80s, no program in college basketball was more polarizing, and no program was more exciting than the UNLV Running Rebels. At the center of it all stood Jerry Tarkanian, the man they called Tark the Shark, a coach known for taking in kids that other programs wouldn't even look at twice. Tarkanian didn't just want Lloyd Daniels, he believed he needed him to complete his masterpiece in Las Vegas. According to public records, in the spring of 1986, Tarkanian took an extraordinary and highly controversial step. He became Lloyd's legal guardian. It was a move that blurred every line between coach and father, an attempt to give some kind of steady hand to a young man who had never known one. To get him ready for the bright lights of the NCAA, the plan was to place him at a junior college in California, tucked away from the distractions of the city, where he could quietly work on his academics. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, but the truth underneath was far harder to hide. In television reports from late 1986, it came out that testing showed Lloyd was reading at a 3rd grade level. It was a staggering number, one that laid bare the systemic failure of every single adult who had passed him along, year after year, just to keep him eligible and on a roster. And yet, despite all of it, the basketball world kept spinning. The pressure in Las Vegas kept building toward a fever pitch, as fans waited for their savior to finally arrive. Behind the scenes, the environment was less like a college campus and more like a high-stakes gamble. Lloyd was a young man holding the keys to a kingdom he had no idea how to rule, surrounded by every temptation of a city that never sleeps. Tarkanian was convinced he could protect him, but not even a legal guardianship could stop the momentum of a lifestyle Lloyd had been drifting toward for years. Everything was set for a national championship run, but on a freezing night, just days before his college debut, the entire Las Vegas blueprint was about to shatter completely. The end of the dream didn't happen on a basketball court. It happened in a dusty parking lot in North Las Vegas. On February 9, 1987, the news broke like a thunderclap across the sports world. According to court records, Lloyd Daniels had been arrested in an undercover police sting. He wasn't caught in a high-speed chase or a violent brawl. He was caught in the middle of a destructive dependency that had quietly taken hold of his life. Police reports at the time documented that he was apprehended while attempting to purchase $30 worth of crack cocaine from an undercover officer. The fallout was instant and merciless. Television coverage at the time zeroed in on the image of the Golden Boy in handcuffs, a sight that sent shockwaves through the university administration. Within hours, the school's president made it clear Lloyd's time as a rebel was over before he had ever suited up for a single game. Tarkanian, the man who had fought so hard to become his guardian, was forced by the university to publicly sever all ties. In a heartbreaking press conference, the coach had to watch his entire master plan evaporate into thin air. Why did it have to happen now, right as he stood on the edge of the life he had always wanted? Almost overnight, the #1 recruit in the country became persona non grata. His scholarship was revoked, his legal guardian was gone, and the NBA scouts who had once salivated over his potential began quietly crossing his name off their lists. He was 20 years old, effectively illiterate, and facing the harsh reality of the legal system without a single cent to his name. Stripped of his scholarship and his surrogate father in one blow, Sweet Pea was suddenly a phenom with no team, no safety net, and a dependency that was only getting worse. When the lights of Las Vegas finally went out, Lloyd Daniels found himself wandering through a basketball wilderness that would have broken a lesser man. The elite colleges were gone, and the NBA wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. He was forced down into the Continental Basketball Association, a league full of hungry players grinding it out in cold gyms for a few $100s a week. He landed with the Topeka Sizzlers, but the Lloyd who showed up wasn't the lightning-quick kid from the New York playgrounds anymore. According to Basketball Archives, during that 1988 season, his weight ballooned by nearly 30 pounds as he struggled to keep his personal demons at bay. Reporters at the time noted that the genius-level court vision was still there, but his body simply couldn't keep up with his mind anymore. He was playing in a fog, searching for rhythm while dragging a destructive dependency into every locker room he walked into. According to major sports media reports, management in Topeka eventually ran out of patience and released him after only a handful of games, because the discipline simply wasn't there. It was a humbling fall for a man once compared to Magic Johnson, now finding himself effectively blackballed from the game he loved. He spent the next few months drifting, making brief appearances in obscure leagues, searching for a reason to stay clean. More often than not, he was back in New York, hanging around the same old neighborhoods where his legend had been born and where the temptations were the strongest. He was 21 years old and already starting to look like a what-if story in the making. His professional career was flatlining in one obscure gym after another. But back home in Queens, a petty neighborhood dispute on a spring night was about to turn his entire life into a literal battle for survival. New York City in the late 80s was a place of high stakes and short tempers, especially in the neighborhoods where Lloyd spent his time. On May 11, 1989, the story of Sweet Pea nearly ended on a sidewalk in Hollis. It wasn't some grand conspiracy or a major criminal enterprise that brought him down. It was something far more senseless. According to major sports media reports, Lloyd was shot 3 times during a confrontation over a drug debt that amounted to exactly $8. That was the price put on a legend's life, in the eyes of the man holding the gun. Court records revealed the raw brutality of the encounter, detailing how the bullets tore into his chest and shoulder. For a few days, the basketball world held its breath as news trickled out of a hospital in Queens. One of those bullets ended up permanently lodged in his body, a piece of shrapnel that doctors decided was simply too dangerous to remove. Public records indicate that while he miraculously survived the surgery, the damage to his right shoulder, his shooting shoulder, was considered a career-ending injury by almost every expert in the sport. He walked out of that hospital a changed man, carrying the physical and emotional weight of that night in every single movement he made. The headlines moved on to the next tragedy, and most people simply assumed that Lloyd Daniels would become another cautionary tale whispered about at Rucker Park. The recovery was slow, painful, and lonely, but something in him refused to let the story end on a sidewalk in Hollis. Lying in a hospital bed with shrapnel buried in his shooting shoulder, no one was asking when he'd play basketball again. They were only wondering if he'd survive the week. Most people with a bullet in their chest would be relieved just to make it to the grocery store on their own. Lloyd Daniels was back in a gym before his scars had even fully healed. He had to reinvent himself completely, learning how to shoot the ball with a hitch in his motion, with a shoulder that no longer rotated the way it used to. He began the long, unglamorous grind through the world's minor leagues, trying to prove he could stay sober and stay productive. According to archived international statistics, Lloyd traveled all the way to a league in New Zealand for the 1990-91 season, where he completely dominated the competition, averaging over 30 points a game. In interviews, he spoke about the clarity he found playing overseas, far away from the noise and the ghosts of his past. For the first time, he was treating the game like a job, not a birthright. He returned to the United States and joined the Global Basketball Association, a league most fans have long since forgotten. But according to basketball archives, Lloyd was a revelation there, winning the league's Most Valuable Player award in 1992. He was proving to scouts that even if he'd lost a step of his old speed, his basketball IQ was still miles ahead of everyone else on the floor. Word started spreading through scouting circles. Sweet Pea was back, he was clean, and he was actually playing winning basketball. He had walked through the fire and come out the other side with a different kind of focus. He was dominating gyms in front of a few hundred people at a time. But halfway across the country, an old friend had just been handed the keys to an NBA franchise, and he was looking for a miracle of his own. That one phone call was about to change everything, leading straight to a contract offer from the San Antonio Spurs. It was the kind of phone call that shouldn't have happened in a million years. In the early 90s, Jerry Tarkanian finally reached the mountaintop, hired as the head coach of the San Antonio Spurs. But instead of playing it safe in the pros, Tark went right back to the one talent he could never forget. He called Lloyd Daniels and offered him a chance that almost no one in the NBA believed he deserved. According to NBA transaction archives, in the preseason of 1992, Lloyd Daniels officially signed a contract with the Spurs, completing a journey from the pavement of Queens all the way to the hardwood of the NBA. Reporters at the time noted that the move was widely seen as a massive gamble, a charity case built on a shared history of trouble between a coach and a player who both understood what it meant to be written off. But when the lights went up at the Hemisphere Arena, Lloyd didn't look like a charity case, he looked like he belonged. He wasn't the high-flying kid anymore, but he had become a technician, using his size to see over defenders and his rebuilt shooting stroke to consistently find the bottom of the net. According to official basketball reference archives, the man who had once been left for dead on a sidewalk started 10 games during that rookie season, playing alongside legends like David Robinson. It was the ultimate feel-good story for a league that usually didn't believe in second chances, and the San Antonio crowd embraced him as a local hero. For a few months, it genuinely looked like this fairy tale was heading toward a happy ending. He was 25 years old, finally collecting a real paycheck, and proving that his genius hadn't been fully extinguished. Not by the bullets, and not by the years of neglect. But the honeymoon phase in Texas wouldn't even survive the winter, as tension inside the front office began to clash with Tarkanian's vision for the team. Once the initial shock of Lloyd's arrival wore off, the real grind of an NBA season set in. He was showing flashes of that old playground magic, threading passes through the smallest of gaps, hitting clutch shots that left veteran defenders shaking their heads. He was proving that the legends about him weren't just tall tales told by old men on park benches. But while Lloyd was holding his own, the team around him was falling apart. In a move that sent shockwaves through the entire league, Jerry Tarkanian was fired just 20 games into the 1992-93 season, according to press conference transcripts. With his protector suddenly gone, many expected Lloyd to be the next one shown the door. Instead, the Spurs hired John Lucas, a man who understood Lloyd better than almost anyone else in the world. Lucas had fought his own highly publicized battles with a destructive dependency and had since dedicated his life to helping other athletes find their way back. Television coverage at the time focused heavily on this unusual bond, noting that Lucas didn't just see a player in Lloyd, he saw a kindred spirit, someone who needed a very specific kind of structure to survive the pressures of professional life. Under Lucas, Lloyd genuinely thrived in his role as a versatile scoring threat off the bench. According to official NBA statistics, he finished his rookie season averaging 9.5 points over 64 games, a stat line most rookies would be proud of, let alone one carrying a bullet permanently lodged in his body. He had successfully made it through his first year in the league, but as the off-season approached, the structure and safety of team life began to fade away. Just as he was establishing himself as a legitimate NBA rotation player, summer brought with it rumors of missed practices and a terrifying resurgence of his old demons. The transition from the court to the off-season is often the most dangerous stretch for any player in recovery, and for Lloyd, the absence of a daily schedule turned into a heavy burden. Whispers began circulating through the league that his conditioning was slipping, and that the stability he had found under John Lucas was starting to crumble. According to some reports, the same old habits that had derailed his college career were beginning to shadow him all over again. According to Basketball Archives, Lloyd played 0 regular season games for San Antonio during the 1993-94 season, as the franchise slowly began moving in a different direction. Reporters at the time noted that his disappearance from the rotation wasn't just about his health, it was about trust that had quietly broken down over the long months he spent away from the team. By the time his contract expired, the San Antonio Spurs were no longer willing to gamble on his potential. He found himself back in the familiar, anxious position of a free agent, one carrying a reputation that scared off nearly every serious contender. In a desperate attempt to stay in the league, he landed a tryout with the New York Knicks Summer League squad, hoping for a homecoming that would somehow fix everything. But the New York version of Lloyd Daniels was a shadow of the rookie who had captivated San Antonio just a year earlier. He looked slow, out of rhythm, weighed down by a personal crisis he simply couldn't shake. According to sports media reports, in the summer of 1994, he was cut from the Knicks roster before the regular season had even begun. Unemployed and seemingly out of chances, Daniels answered a frantic phone call from an injury-plagued team in Los Angeles that was willing to take one last look at the legend. If there was ever a stage built for a comeback story as cinematic as Lloyd Daniels, it was the Forum in Los Angeles. By the mid-90s, the Lakers were a team in transition, searching for a spark, and the stories of a street ball legend with a bullet still in his chest had finally reached the West Coast. According to official NBA statistics, during the 1994-95 season, Lloyd finally got the call to put on the purple and gold. He signed a 10-day contract, a move reporters at the time described as a low-risk, high-reward gamble for a franchise that had always had a soft spot for a showman. On the court, the magic hadn't completely vanished. He was playing alongside young, hungry stars like Nick Van Exel and Eddie Jones, and there were nights when Sweet Pea looked like he had never even left the playgrounds of Queens. According to archived box scores, he managed to log a 20-plus point performance in a Lakers uniform, proving he could still fill up the stat sheet when his rhythm was right. Across those 25 games in Los Angeles, he averaged 7.5 points, showing a veteran poise that suggested he might have finally found a permanent home. But the bright lights of Hollywood had a way of exposing everything a box score couldn't hide. While his shooting eye remained elite, the hard miles and physical trauma of his past were finally catching up with him. He found himself struggling to keep pace with the lightning-fast guards of the 90s, and his lack of lateral quickness turned him into a liability on the defensive end of the floor. The Hollywood comeback was a brilliant flash in the pan, but his body, battered by age, by personal struggles, and by a gunshot wound, began to visibly betray him during a late-season road trip. After the Lakers decided not to extend his stay, Lloyd Daniels entered the most grueling phase of any professional athlete's life, the nomadic existence of a fringe NBA player. He became a regular fixture on the 10-day contract circuit, a world where you live out of a suitcase and every missed jumper feels like a pink slip waiting to happen. According to NBA transaction archives, during the 1995-96 season, he signed with the Philadelphia 76ers, appearing in exactly 5 games. That season, the press was already writing about a man who seemed to be running out of time, a legend slowly turning into a footnote. The grind didn't stop in Philadelphia. He bounced to the Sacramento Kings, then to the New Jersey Nets, trying to convince coach after coach that his basketball IQ was still worth a roster spot, even if his legs had grown heavy. According to official league archives, during his stints between 1996 and 97, his playing time collapsed to under 10 minutes a game. In interviews, he said something close to being simply happy to still be in the room. But the reality was that he was fighting for survival in a league that kept getting younger and faster by the season. The physical decline was impossible to ignore. The explosive first step that had once made him a superstar in New York was gone, replaced by a cautious, ground-bound version of his game. He was no longer the centerpiece of anyone's master plan. He had become a specialist, brought in for a few minutes of veteran leadership and the occasional perimeter shot. Teams weren't chasing the ghost of the New York street legend anymore. They just needed a warm body to fill out the end of the bench before the 1997 trade deadline. The final stop on Lloyd Daniels' NBA journey was north of the border with a young expansion team called the Toronto Raptors. By the time he arrived in Canada, the story of Sweet Pea had already become a piece of league lore, a cautionary tale that younger players had heard about but never fully witnessed for themselves. According to official NBA statistics, Lloyd appeared in his final professional games early in the 1997-98 season. Television coverage at the time focused on the veteran presence he brought to a struggling roster, but the writing was already on the wall. He wasn't there to save the franchise, he was there to fill a gap. In what would become the final act of his career on the big stage, Lloyd played 6 games for the Raptors, offering one last glimpse of the scoring touch that had once defined his youth. According to Basketball Archives, he averaged 5.5 points in those final appearances, a quiet, sobering close to a career that had once been predicted to be Hall of Fame caliber. There were no retirement tours, no standing ovations, just a quiet realization that the speed of the game had finally outpaced what his battered body had left to give. When the Raptors decided to move in a different direction and released him, the truth hit home. The lights of the big leagues were going out for good. He had played exactly 200 regular season games in the NBA, a number that sounds small until you remember that a bullet was still lodged inside his body for every single one of them. When the Raptors front office processed his final release papers in November of 1997, Lloyd was forced to confront a reality he had been running from since he was a teenager: life without the shield of professional basketball. When the NBA dream finally went quiet in Toronto, many expected Lloyd Daniels to simply fade away or fall back into the gravity of the streets that had once nearly claimed him. But for a man who had survived bullets and a full-blown crack epidemic, the end of a contract was never going to be the end of his life. Lloyd became a true basketball lifer, a familiar ghost haunting gyms from Puerto Rico all the way to the CBA. According to international sports databases, he continued playing professional basketball well into the mid-2000s, spanning 3 separate decades and playing deep into his late 30s. For him, the game was no longer about fame or millions of dollars. It was simply the one place in the world where everything still made sense. Reporters at the time noted that while his knees had grown heavy and his jersey seemed to change every few months, the genius of Sweet Pea never truly left him. He became something like a traveling professor of the game, suiting up for more than 15 different professional franchises around the world, according to player archives. He played in the USBL, in the CBA, and in small towns scattered across Europe and South America, often for just enough money to keep moving forward. In interviews, he said something close to the idea that the basketball court was the only place where he felt truly safe from the temptations that had almost ended him back in New York. As the years went by, he slowly began the transition from the man taking the shots to the man teaching them. He started coaching AAU teams and working with minor league programs, using his own scars as a kind of map for the next generation of New York City guards. He had survived a destructive addiction, 3 bullets to the chest, and the brutal business of the NBA. But as he stepped away from the court for the very last time, one question remained: how would history judge the man they called Sweet Pea? Decades after he first stepped onto the asphalt in Queens, the legacy of Lloyd Daniels remains one of the most debated stories in the history of the game. In the barbershops of Harlem and the parks of Brooklyn, the what-if conversation still happens every Saturday morning. Was he really as good as Magic? Could he have been the greatest to ever do it, if that night in Las Vegas had gone differently? In 2015, the release of the documentary The Legend of Sweet Pea brought these questions back to the forefront, as major sports media reviews explored the thin line between his immense talent and his severe personal struggles. Official league archives offer a far more sobering reality than the playground myths ever did. He finished his NBA career averaging 7 1/10 points per game across exactly 200 regular season games. To some, those numbers might look like disappointment, a sign of talent wasted. But to those who know what he actually went through, the academic failures, the destructive dependency, and the shrapnel that remained lodged in his body for the rest of his life, those 200 games are nothing short of a miracle. He didn't just play in the NBA, he survived it after the world had already declared him finished before he'd even started. The story of Lloyd Daniels isn't a tragedy, and it isn't a fairy tale. It's a story of endurance. He stands as a reminder that the game can save you just as easily as the world can break you. He may never have become the next Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he never landed the multi-million-dollar sneaker deal. But Lloyd Daniels walked away with something even rarer. He walked away with a pulse, a story that people are still telling, and the unmistakable truth that against every imaginable odd, he made it anyway.